Alright, hello everybody, this is AW, today here with Chaya. Now Hyperion, he's off vacationing somewhere. Happy holidays, I guess, and Halloween. So anyways, today we're continuing to read the 1844 manuscripts, the section on estranged labor, starting at section 24 in this essay. So, starting. We have still a third aspect of estranged labor to deduce from the two already considered. Man is a species being, not only because in practice and in theory he adopts the species, his own as well as those of other things, as his object, but, and this is only another way of expressing it, also because he treats himself as the actual living species, because he treats himself as a universal and therefore a free being. So this is one of those things which people for some reason have trouble understanding, and I don't know. It seems kind of straightforward to me. To be a species being is to be a being that can conceive of itself as a type of being, and others as a type of being. So in knowing that I am human, and saying I am human, you know, I treat myself as a universal, therefore a free being. Or at least treating myself as a universal. I don't know about the free being part. That seems kind of a bit of a jump there. But we'll see what he says more on this. The life of the species, both in man and in animals, consists physically in the fact that man, like the animal, lives on organic nature. And the more universal man or the animal is, the more universal is the sphere of inorganic nature on which he lives, just as plants, animals, stones, air, light, etc. constitute theoretically a part of human consciousness, partly as objects of natural science, partly as objects of art. His spiritual inorganic nature, spiritual nourishment, which he must first prepare to make palatable and digestible. So also the realm of practice, they constitute a part of human life and human activity. Physically, man lives only on these products of nature, whether they appear in the form of food, heating, clothes, a dwelling, etc. The universality of man appears in practice precisely in the universality which makes all nature his inorganic body, both inasmuch as nature is one, his direct means of life, and two, the material, the object, and the instrument of his life activity. Nature is man's inorganic body, nature, that is, insofar as it is not itself human body. Man lives on nature, means that nature is his body. Hold on. Means that nature is his body, with which he must remain in continuous interchange if he is not to die. That man's physical and spiritual life is linked to nature means simply that nature is linked to itself, for man is a part of nature. Though in your views, I think you'd have a bit to say on this.
No, well, I think it's pretty straightforward. Yes, I do agree that humans are a part of nature, and he describes receiving the spiritual essence from nature. I mean, I definitely see that. I don't really have that much more to add, though, but I don't know. I mean, it seems like a pretty straightforward piece, very romantic. Um,
Yeah. It's pretty monistic, actually. It's a man in union with
yes.
nature. It is romantic to say, nature is my body in a way, in which there's this collapse of identity. Which in a way makes sense in the ways that we incorporate nature as a sort of tool, an extension of ourselves. I mean, nowadays, a similar sort of idea is something called the extended mind, for example, in which some philosophers will consider technology as a sort of extension, technology and tools as extensions of human mind, human intellect. You don't have to do complex math calculations. A calculator does it for you. You don't have to remember entire catalogs of history of index things. You just go and like use a search box, and the computer will find it for you. So you externalize a lot of things to you can externalize a lot of things to nature as well as to technology. It makes more sense with products of human labor more so than products of nature as such, though. I mean, it's kind of like saying, the Amazon is my lungs, for example, in a really, really stretched out consideration. Yeah, but in the normal limitation of the concepts, not really. But either way, it's that kind of stuff was the stuff I really liked when I first got into Marx. I thought it was definitely pretty romantic and an emotional sense. It's a really beautiful passages. Things to consider. So continuing, in estranging from man one nature and two himself, his own active functions, his life activity, estranged labor estranges the species from man. It changes for him the life of the species into a means of individual life. First, it estranges the life of the species and individual life. And secondly, it makes individual life in its abstract form the purpose of the life of the species. Likewise, in its abstract and estranged form. I'm just slowly rethinking that one. In estranging from man one nature and two himself, his own active functions, his life activity, strange labor, estranges the species from man. It changes for him the life of the species into a means of individual life. First, it estranges the life of the species and individual life, and secondly, it makes individual life in its abstract form the purpose of the life of the species, likewise in its abstract and estranged form. It's a strange passage. Let's see if it makes more sense with the next one. Continuing, for labor, life activity, productive life itself, appears to man in the first place merely as a means of satisfying a need, the need to maintain physical existence. Yet the productive life is the life of the species. It is life engendering life. The whole character of a species, its species character, is contained in the character of its life activity. And free, conscious activity is man's species character. Life itself appears only as a means to life. So this seems kind of strange. It's sort of a. It seems sort of to be the reduction of man to a more primitive animal life. It seems, in which the only reason to live is just to keep on living, and not for anybody else or the species to keep on living, but for me to keep on living.
Which I would even say that's a pretty oversimplified understanding of quote unquote primitive peoples anyway. Like I don't necessarily think that tribal peoples, archaic peoples only live for the sake of survival. I mean, it seems way oversimplified.
Yeah, I'm not sure if he's talking about primitive societies, but I'm not quite sure what he's talking about. It's some kind of strange labor, but I'm not sure what kind. So continuing, the animal is immediately one with its life activity. It does not distinguish itself from it. It is its life activity. Man makes his life activity itself the object of his will and of his consciousness. He has conscious life activity. It is not a determination with which he directly merges. Conscious life activity distinguishes man immediately from animal life activity. It is just because of this that he is a species being, or it is only because he is a species being that he is a conscious being, that his own life is an object for him. Only because of that is his activity free activity. Estranged labor reverses the relationship so that it is just because man is a conscious being that he makes his life activity, his essential being, a mere means to his existence. Okay, so it's starting to make a bit more sense, in which the estranged labor here, obviously, then he must be talking about capitalist labor, in which
Mm-hmm.
we use what is essentially human about us, which is universal thought, the capacity for universal labors, making tools, doing just about anything. But we don't work for it to express us or our essential being, or for the sake of just expressing that essential being. We express that essential being for the sake of merely continuing to exist, merely continuing to labor. It's the thesis that the worker only exists on subsistence and nothing more, which is, partly historically true, partly historically false. I mean, for example, being poor in the first world gives you a hell of a leeway still to do far, far more than just merely exist. You have at your disposal a lot more things which correspond to your essential being, your species essence, which you can express, not completely freely, but nonetheless pretty freely. Us doing this cheap recording here is one example. High culture, the utter depths of human intellect and the heights of it are available to us insofar as we can read and we really have, the curiosity for it. Of course, the system engenders a drive against curiosity, a one-dimensional culture, as Marcuse calls it, which does tend to lead not just to mere existence, but to just a kind of repetitive, monotonous, unreflective life. Continuing. In creating a world of objects by his personal activity, in his work upon inorganic nature, man proves himself a conscious species being, that is, as a being that treats the species as his own essential being, or that treats itself as a species being. Admittedly, animals also produce. They build themselves nests, dwellings like the bees, beavers, ants, etc., but an animal only produces what it immediately needs for itself or its young. It produces one-sidedly, whilst man produces universally. It produces only under the dominion of immediate physical need, whilst man produces even when he is free from physical need, and only truly produces in freedom therefrom. An animal produces only itself, whilst man reproduces the whole of nature. An animal's product belongs immediately to its physical body, whilst man freely confronts his product. An animal forms only in accordance with the standard and the need of the species to which it belongs, whilst man knows how to produce in accordance with the standard of every species, and knows how to apply everywhere the inherent standard to the object. Man therefore also forms objects in accordance with the laws of beauty. So this is a shift in what's the meaning here, which I think is strange. Where their species being was simply about the self-recognition of it oneself as a species, and therefore, implies the universality of thought, the self-reflection of self-consciousness. Here it is in creating a world of objects by his personal activity. In his work upon inorganic nature, man proves himself a conscious species being, that is, as a being that treats the species as his own essential being, or that treats itself as a species being. I don't see what tool making really has to do with considering oneself as a human being, for example.
Uh-huh.
Because, I mean, there are animals which are tool builders, not to the extent that we are, but they definitely learn to build tools. We know, for example, chimpanzees don't just have an instinct to use rocks and sticks. They have to learn it. It's a semi-cultural thing. Ravens, for example, are extremely smart, and they learn a lot of things and pass it on. They can actually mimic the sounds of. They're kind of like they have the capacities like parrots. They can mimic sounds.
Hmm.
Um,
Or
so
beavers build dams, although I don't know if that's instinctual or if they actually have to learn how to do that. But
yeah, so I don't know if that really makes sense that by laboring that one proves that one is self-conscious. I mean, one can be a hippie, living out in the wilderness and just kind of enjoying the sun and living off berries. Boring as that may seem to people, but when I don't think that laboring as such, to be creating tools, objects, necessarily is proof that one is a conscious species being. Just seems a weird reduction to me. I mean, of all the things that would prove that one is a species being, you'd think it'd be language, you'd think it'd be culture, you'd think it'd be self consciousness, but no, it's labor. But I guess that's kind of a missing the point in which these are notes, and Marx says in other places that labor is purpose of activity. So labor already, the crafting of objects already implies labor, and labor already implies the entirety of the capacities of conceptual knowledge, the capacities of culture, the capacities of self-reflection, self-consciousness, etc. But even then, it just seems, I don't know, strange. Strange to make that reduction. It's not that it shouldn't be there. I think it is one of the ways in which we show that we are conscious species being, but it's not the only way, and it's not the hallmark of having such. For example, if we found out that dolphins, which it seems that dolphins like do have something that's eerily like edging close to the only other animal that seems to have language capacities, like actual uh, language capacities, conceptual language like we do. And if that comes to the case, that would prove that they are too a species being, despite the fact that dolphins unfortunately don't have hands and can't really craft much. But yeah, the species being is shown not in just the production of a world of objects, but the production of a universal that is mediated by thought, a purposeful, conceptual, free production that is shows that we are a conscious species being. And so, in that sense, yes, it makes complete sense. Although I don't know, when he says an animal produces only itself, whilst man reproduces the whole of nature, seems odd to me.
well, the way he's phrasing it, like reproduces the whole of nature. I mean, now granted, these are just notes, but I don't know, just something about that phrase seems kind of off.
Um, yeah, it is. It is kind of off because I mean, what does that mean? I don't know what that means. I mean, if it's just another way of what he was saying earlier, but we have the capacities of universal thought, and so we get to know just about everything. So not only can we screw and make babies, we can make trees, we can plant them, we can culture them, we can mate dogs, and have puppers that we love. But that just seems weird because we're not the only ones who do that. By the way, we found, rare as it is, there are other creatures in this world that know, for example, about planting, that know, have this instinctual knowledge or learned knowledge, perhaps, that you gather seeds and you spread them around because they'll grow into whatever it is that you eat later on. Some animals definitely do that very purposefully. Other animals, what is it? There's that one species of ants that like literally milks aphids. They treat them as like a sort of a cattle. They take care of them. They bring them together. They raise them, and they drink that sweet, sweet butt nectar that they make. So, just a weird way to phrase it. Not quite sure exactly what he means. It's not quite clear, and it's not quite true, I think. But I think interpreted in the ways that, well, man can produce just about anything, except clone sheep. We still suck with clones. They still don't last. We don't know why. But we'll get there. We'll show you one God.
Ah, anyway. Anyway.
All right, continuing. It is just in his work upon the objective world, therefore, that man really proves himself to be a species being. This production is his active species life. Through this production, nature appears as his work and his reality. The object of labor is, therefore, the objectification of man's species life, for he duplicates himself not only as in consciousness intellectually, but also actively in reality, and therefore he sees himself in a world that he has created. In tearing away from man the object of his production, therefore, estranged labor tears from him his species life, his real objectivity as a member of the species, and transforms his advantage over animals into the disadvantage that his inorganic body, nature, is taken from him. So here's the continuance of the romanticization and an absolutization of labor, as specifically as physical labor, in which it seems that intellectual labor is of no consequence or value to Marx. He says, the object of labor is therefore the objectification of man's species life, for he duplicates himself not only as in consciousness, intellectually, but also actively in reality. As if thinking is not an activity, as if thinking does not produce real things. As a cultural work of art is mostly intellectual rather than, physical. You write a book, it's a bunch of cheap words. It's probably one of the easiest things to produce, except for the actual thinking part.
Or study in general. I mean,
Yeah.
study is, technically labor, in a sense.
So, nowadays you write a story, you send it to the publisher owns the rights, blah, blah, blah. Have you lost a part of yourself now? It seems strange to say that one does, because the production was intellectual. It was the expression of your own spiritual doing while you were writing it. But you wrote it, you remember it. You have your own copy. It's like, if you feel like it, you can put it out there. Not just today, but in the past, you could put it out there under some pirate publishers and say fuck you to the publisher itself. I mean, if you cared. If I sow a potato and the boss says, that's my potato now, I just can't care, man. It's a potato. Yeah, I planted it, but it's not my baby. It's not like raising a dog and it's literally your thing. It's not like making a work of art in which you painted something grandiose and unique, and it's your whole emotion is tied to that unique single instance of that work of art, and saying, well, you can just paint it again, it just isn't the same. That's kind of how art is. The originality and uniqueness of the single original piece is something very unique to art. And with that, it makes sense. But with everything else, it's like, I made a stick and you take it away. It's like, well, you got to sell the stick now. I just don't feel any love for that stick. I really don't care. Like, you're not taking my species life. Yeah, it's just a stick. Now if it was like my grandpa's stick or something, I put a lot of work and effort to that. It was like the first stick I ever made, and it's a walkie stick. And that's how I learned. That's got sentimental value. It's got a real emotional tie to me. I do feel there is a part of me tied to that. But, just like any labor, however, it's just not really a creative piece of labor. It's like going and fishing is not really the most human thing to do for me to do. I mean, if you really love fishing, good for you. It's like you are a master fisher. You know all the ins and outs. It is what you do. You are as you do. You go catch those marlins or whatever they're called. I mean, because in a way, there are cultures in which these so-called, simply menial things are works of art in a way. I
Uh-huh.
think, because I mean, there's some culture, it's like one of those Southeast Asian cultures, in which the local culture is a rite of passage is you go out in like your little canoe into the water and you catch yourself a shark barehanded. And then you catch it and you're like, all right, fuck you, shark. And then you throw it back in the water, and you're still like, that's my shark. And some guy comes around, just like kills it right there with a harpoon. You're like, but that was like it's a special shark for you.
Well, that must be incredibly shameful too. I mean, if it's your rite of passage, I mean,
Yeah, yeah. But those are very intellectually, conceptually laden things. They're not just oh, I was doing work, I was doing labor. Well, who cares? For the most part, labor people don't like labor as such.
well, there's an intellectual technique to those things as well. I mean,
Yeah, it becomes an
yeah.
art. There's a You see this with apprenticeships, the few apprenticeships that still remain, in which it's still kind of a family thing, in which it's passed from generation to generations, in which the younger generation doesn't love what they're being saddled with. Your dad, your mom are a sushi chef, and they're like, you're gonna inherit this restaurant. Well, you got to become a sushi chef for you, and you got to do that for like 20 years for you to be finally ready. If not more, actually, it seems often it's far more, like 30, even 40 years, for them to finally say, okay, you're ready to inherit and become the head sushi chef. But by the time you've spent so much of your life on that shit which you hated, you end up liking it. You've actually gained mastery. You're proud of it. It becomes a part of you, despite how much you thought it was shitty. Despite how much you hated the piano when you first started. Eventually it just became a thing that you could do, and you realize that one day you take pleasure in it. You have great pleasure in actually just simply doing it, and you've done the work. You hated the work, but you like the payoff. It's become a way for you to express yourself. It's a work of art. It's an activity that is definitely self-expressive. But just being a worker in the field is not one of those things. So continuing, similarly integrating spontaneous, free activity to a means, estranged labor makes man's species life a means to his physical existence. The consciousness which man has for his species is thus transformed by estrangement in such a way that species life becomes for him a means. So here, that species life, I think, is kind of meant in a very broad sense of the universal freedom which we have, by virtue of the kind of being that we are, thinking, cultural, intellectual being. Which can labor, can do things with thought, can make things in thought come into reality. The thing he says in the prior sentence, similarly integrating spontaneous free activity to a means, estranged labor makes man, species life, a means to his physical existence. This is a pernicious thing today. I mean, you see this everywhere. It's like, your boss tells you, hey, you've worked hard this whole week. You gotta go have fun, like, simmer down, decompress, so you can come back on Monday and work better, right?
Mm-hmm.
You can't have fun for fun's sake. No, you gotta have fun. You literally are told you must have fun. You can't be working. You're gonna wear yourself out, and you're not gonna work so well, buddy. So you gotta go have fun to be a better worker. You know, your free spontaneous activity becomes estranged from you. It becomes just a means to working, a means to keep on being part of the capitalist economy.
Yeah, and usually too, that free time is dominated with things like consumerism. Like, what do people usually do in their free time? I mean, they go shopping, they go to restaurants. That it's all tied up with the capitalist system.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the things that's horrible about modern life, and It's in our very language. Time is money. Don't waste your time, quote unquote. Uh, investing. Literally, like for example, video games. People go for multiplayer video games, and they go to a forum and they're like, "Why should I invest in this game?" Meaning, why should I buy this game and why should I play it? And you think, well, you'd play it because it's fun, right? Because you like it. Not for some other alternative reason. Like, what in the world does it mean to be investing time in a game? What do you expect to get out? Like some money returns or something? Like, is like somebody gonna see you? And it's like, oh, that guy plays such and such a game. Give him a fucking raise. That's not gonna fucking happen. I mean, it's stupid, but people do think that way. It's especially the generations in which we live in and the generations following us up to now. Like, it's just a really, really pernicious way of thinking. People also see other people that way. Friendships are investments. You gotta make connections. Meeting people is investment. It really does degrade everything. To an alienated existence. So human freedom becomes nothing but a means for our own self-enslavement.
Mhm.
So continuing, estranged labor turns thus: 3. Man's species being, both nature and his spiritual species property, into a being alien to him, into a means of his individual existence. It estranges from man his own body as well as external nature and his spiritual aspect, his human aspect. 4. An immediate consequence of the fact that man is estranged from the product of his labor, from his life activity, from his species being, is the estrangement of man from man. When man confronts himself, he confronts the other man. What applies to man's relation to his work, to the product of his labor, and to himself also holds of a man's relations to the other man, and to the other man's labor and object of labor. And here I would suppose that it's a sort of precursor to his idea of fetishism, in which, we no longer seem to think in terms of person to person relations so much as commodity to commodity relations. Um, and this is mostly not a thing of just the market as such. There is a culture which perpetuates and generates this. Because you go to other cultures which aren't as individualistic as the U.S., for example, like Mexico, Hispanics. Hispanics are pretty communal people, and you still have this idea of going over to your neighbor and asking for a cup of sugar, and just going over and inviting your neighbors for lunch or dinner, and you invite each other and you chat and you still go and say hello. In which not everything is a tit for tat. You still treat other people in that manner of other people. It's not like the silly thing of friendships at work, in which like, hey, I'll treat you to lunch this week, but you treat me to lunch next week. The expectation is of an exchange already. It's not really caring about the other person so much as like what you're exchanging. But I don't think that merely in having work in which you work for in a job and you produce things which are then taken away from you, and which just is, it's a really romantic thing, a romantic notion of work. I mean, just look at normal work today, and it's just, I don't care. But in that sense, I mean, you don't really lose necessarily that relationship of man to man. Uh, Although it makes it a whole lot easier to lose it and turn it into something which perverts the essence of human being as such. So continuing, in fact, the proposition that man's species nature is estranged from him means that one man is estranged from the other, as each of them is from man's essential nature. Basically, the absolute reduction of humanity to, what is it that they call it? Homo economicus. The idea that we're all selfish.
Or that everything can be explained through economic relations or
Yeah.
capitalist economic relations.
Yep. Your kids are an investment, your mom is an investment, your cousins are an investment, everything, in reality, you think you love people. What you really want is, you want the investment to pay off. Your wife is an investment. Your husband is an investment. Your lover is an investment, etc. So continuing, in fact, uh, the estrangement of man, and in every relationship in which man stands to himself, is realized and expressed only in the relationship in which man stands to other men. Hence, within the relationship of estranged labor, each man views the other in accordance with the standard in the relationship in which he finds himself as a worker. So, unfortunately, there is that trend and the pressure in uh, the actual economy for things to be reduced that way, especially when culture just is allowed to collapse straight into it. But nonetheless, we don't live in a world in which this is wholly completely true, in which, we still find ways in which we can see other people as people, although we don't do it anywhere near as enough as, is healthy to a society and ourselves as persons. Because if it wasn't that kind of thing, then we wouldn't have such things as, identity politics. We don't have these kinds of things in which people really cared about racism. We wouldn't have these things in which people cared about the poor, for example, or people cared about, the lack of culture. So not everything gets collapsed into the market economy. Not everything is seen as just a pure relationship of commodities, but a whole hell of a lot does. All right, new section, section 25. We took from a fact of political economy the estrangement of the worker in his production. We have formulated this fact in conceptual terms as estranged, alienated labor. We have analyzed this concept, hence analyzing merely a fact of political economy. Let us now see further how the concept of estranged, alienated labor must express and present itself in real life. If the product of labor is alien to me, if it confronts me as an alien power, to whom then does it belong? To a being other than myself. Who is this being? To gods? To be sure, in the earliest times, the principal production, for example, the building of the temples, etc., in Egypt, India, and Mexico, appears to be in the service of the gods, and the product belongs to the gods. However, the gods on their own were never the lords of labor. No more was nature. And what a contradiction it would be if, the more man subjugated nature by his labor, and the more the miracles of the gods were rendered superfluous by the miracles of industry, the more man were to renounce the joy of production and the enjoyment of the product to please these powers. The alien being, to whom labor and the product of labor belongs, in whose service labor is done, and for whose benefit the product of labor is provided, can only be man himself. If the product of labor does not belong to the worker, if it confronts him as an alien power, then this can only be because it belongs to some other man than the worker. If the worker's activity is a torment to him, to another it must give satisfaction and pleasure. Not the gods, not nature, but only man himself can be this fallen power over man. Alright, so typical critique. Although, quite frankly, I can say honestly, I miss making shit for God, because we made some fucking awesome shit. Let me tell you. Like, our odes to our no our modern god of capital are like just ugly things. I mean, really ugly. Like, you don't get stuff like the Taj Mahal. You don't get stuff like the pyramids.
The European
Oh
cathedrals, I
my
mean,
god, the the Gothic cathedrals are just amazing. I mean, literal works of art, which who cannot appreciate those? I mean, they were made for, oh, but they were made for, a phony god. I don't give a fuck. They're pretty fucking awesome. I hope God enjoys them. I mean, I suppose we made the French made the Statue of Liberty, which is pretty cool and all right, I guess. But we really don't make like awesome shit anymore. You think we would, but apparently man just doesn't like awesome shit.
Well, you think about too in capitalism, like you have that utility there where everything has to serve the market. You can't really build a great monument anymore. It has to, like, everything is dominated by money and investments and all that. I mean, like it's not considered practical or a good use of your money to just build a bunch of random stuff. It has to serve that interest.
Yeah. So there's also the issue of time compression. You can't take 6 centuries to make a Gothic cathedral. Which when I took my humanities class and I found out, oh, they took that. Gee, like, there were some that took that long, and I was like, damn. Literally, like generations of human beings lived and died, saw that thing being built throughout their lives, and when it was finished, the whole town was like, "We made this shit for God."
Oh.
I mean, it's like it was a great thing. I mean, everybody loved it. People says like, but it was forced labor. One, it was kind of forced free labor. It was the church says we're gonna build it. We're gonna get the materials. Please donate your time. By donate, we mean you better do it for free, or we're gonna shame the hell out of you and get you kicked out of the town. But either way, I mean, it was pretty awesome stuff. Like, I think they're not just monuments to God, but also monuments to humanity. So continuing, we must bear in mind the previous proposition that man's relation to himself becomes for him objective and actual through his relation to the other man. Thus, if the product of his labor objectified, is for him an alien, hostile, powerful object independent of him, then his position towards it as such that someone else is master of this object, someone who is alien, hostile, powerful, and independent of him. If he treats his own activity as an unfree activity, then he treats it as an activity performed in the service, under the dominion, the coercion, and the yoke of another man. So, the typical treatment of wage labor, and in more words than less. In which, I mean, I have a slight problems in which, like, I don't think many people feel this way so much. Is like they don't feel, that they're losing so much of their life activity and like, oh no, the boss took my burger away, which I spent 15 minutes flipping. My soul, how I lost a piece of you. No, the most soulless thing is one, you go to work and, nobody appreciates what you do. Not the customers, not the people who are over you, not the people who are beside you. You don't get to make good burgers. You're rushed. You make that ugly, sad, pathetic piece of thing at McDonald's. Seriously, God, they're hideous. So, it's false advertising, I tell you. They make them look so good on the advertisements, but when you get it, you're like, really? It's a stinky piece of crap? But most of it is that, no, a lack of recognition so much as like, oh no, I'm flipping burgers. Because, I have a really crappy, repetitive, monotonous job at a warehouse. I don't really care. Like, I don't feel like I'm wasting my life away. Oh, how I could be doing other things. I really don't mind at this point. Because I'd be at home doing nothing for the most part anyways. I don't get to just write all day, even, or read all day. I just, it's exhausting. It's too much. You read for like an hour a day. You try to write for an hour or two, and the rest of the times you watch random stupid YouTube videos just to waste time away. The only thing that sucks at work is, well, you don't get recognized. You figured out some new, better way to do it. The managers are like, cool, thank you, and you now are expected to do that, which does it better and faster. But hey, no raise, no bonus, no whatever. It's not even like, here, have a lunch. Nah. So, I don't think that most people really care about doing something that it's just not what their dream job. They want time to do things freely, but this idea that we feel so oppressed because we're not spending 24/7 of our days, living the dream. Well, even if you're an artist, you don't live the dream 24/7. Most of it is just like looking for inspiration. Just trying to finish that one thing that just been sitting there. So I think it's a bit of an extreme position to say, it's like every bit of labor that we do is some kind of like essential thing stolen from us. Nah, not really. Continuing, every self-estrangement of man from himself and from nature appears in the relation in which he places himself and nature to men, other than and differentiated from himself. For this reason, religious self-estrangement necessarily appears in the relationship of the layman to the priest, or again to a mediator, etc., since we are here dealing with the intellectual world. In the real practical world, self-estrangement can only become manifest through the real practical relationship to other men. And my dog wants to crawl in here along with me on this tiny couch. He's too fat. Continuing, the medium through which estrangement takes place is itself practical. Thus, through estranged labor, man not only creates his relationship to the object and to the act of production as to powers that are alien and hostile to him, he also creates the relationship in which other men stand to his production and to his product, and the relationship in which he stands to these other men. Just as he creates his own production as a loss of his reality, as his punishment, his own product as a loss, as a product not belonging to him, so he creates the domination of the person who does not produce overproduction and over the product. Just as he estranges his own activity from himself, so he confers upon the stranger an activity which is not his own. So some of these are obviously very biased. For example, the second sentence there. For this reason, so religious self-estrangement necessarily appears in the relationship of the layman to the priest, or again to a mediator, etc. Since we are here dealing with the intellectual world, that's not true. There's plenty of religions in which there is no priest, and which the priest can't help you with God. Religious mysticism is one of those things in which there is no mediator. You're expected to have direct communion with God through meditation techniques, through other things that you do.
Well, even in mainstream Judaism, I mean, Kohanim are not archons. Like, they're not, like, they don't have political authority. They're just there for ritual purposes, for instance.
Yeah, so religious self-estrangement is, if it is estrangement, doesn't just occur through another human being. I mean, I know, unfortunately, a few too many people who have a very, very unhappy consciousness in which they don't care about priests so much as they just think, they're forever estranged from God no matter what. I am here, a sinful, finite human being. God is over there. There is no one and nothing that could possibly mediate that and save me. And I don't know what to do. That kind of level of estrangement, an absolute estrangement.
You think you've fallen so far down that like nothing you do can actually pick yourself up and repair your relationship with God.
Yeah, that's how they feel.
Yeah.
So in the real practical world, self-estrangement can only become manifest through the real practical relationship to other men. So once again, not really. I mean, even when you don't have things mediating between you and people, there's a lot of self-estrangement going on. Some of it which is impossible to make a bridge between. There is just a fundamental self-alienation in which, you need other people, you desire and you need love, you need affection, you need recognition, you need validation, and yet you have to put trust in people, but you can never truly know, the depths of that other person, like yourself, and they can never know the depths of you either. So there's always a tension of the possibility that things aren't as they seem. You think, they feel this one way about you, but they don't, or they think you feel one way about them, but they don't. You think they'll be there for you at some point, but that's their breaking point, and they'll say, no, sorry, I can't follow you there, can't forgive you on that one. So there's plenty of person-to-person estrangement, which has nothing to do with these physical, practical ways of alienation. So the medium through which estrangement takes place is itself practical, in a way, I suppose. But then again, once again, just look at R9K, for example. Like, the people in R9K were just like so-called robots, NEETs. A lot of these people are what they are because, unfortunately, that's how they conceive of themselves, and that's how they want to be. You try to help them, and they're just stuck there, and they really fundamentally don't want to get out. They're comfortable in their own little box of misery, in a way.
I mean, I would say that they're probably sadomasochistic, that they love this idea. They get off on pain and they get off on inflicting pain. So they take almost some kind, like they have this almost, they take pleasure in being beaten down, like self-condemnation, thinking, oh, I'm so gross, I'm so ugly. But then they also get pleasure out of going after anyone who tries to lend them a hand. Like, oh, you don't know anything. Oh, you're such an idiot. Why are you trying to tell me this? I mean, I don't know that much about psychology, but that's just what I see when I venture onto those places.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of simple stuff. Psychoanalysis probably goes way more in depth, but it's definitely an estrangement of human to human, strange from human essence. But it has nothing to do with, or it has little to do with a practicality. For some people, it just happens. Just unfortunately, they're just, whatever it is that is about them, they're just primed to use that as a psychological mechanism. So interesting. The next one. Thus, through estranged labor, man not only creates his relationship to the object and to the act of production as to powers, that are alien and hostile to him, he also creates the relationship in which other men stand to his production and to his product, and the relationship in which he stands to these men. So it's a typical logical relation of, in order to have a master, you got to have a slave. But, the slave isn't going to be a slave for long if he doesn't take himself to be a slave or herself to be a slave. Because otherwise you'll have a fight. You have a life and death struggle, as Hegel puts it. So, the slave must recognize the master as master, just as the master is recognizes the slave as slave. And in this way, they mutually constitute each other. The master is the master because the slave recognizes him as master, and the slave is a slave because the master recognizes him as a slave. So some simple logic. Continuing, we have until now considered this relationship only from the standpoint of the worker, and later on we shall be considering it also from the standpoint of the non-worker. Through estranged, alienated labor, then, the worker produces the relationship to his labor of a man alien to labor and standing outside it. The relationship to the worker to labor, creates the relation to it of the capitalist, or whatever one chooses to call the master of labor. Private property is thus the product, the result, the necessary consequence of alienated labor, of the external relation of the worker to nature and to himself. Okay. Private property thus results by analysis from the concept of alienated labor, that is, of alienated man, of estranged labor, or of estranged life, of estranged man. So, alright, let me continue it. True, it is as a result of the movement of private property that we have obtained the concept of alienated labor, of alienated life and political economy. But on analysis of this concept, it becomes clear that though private property appears to be the reason, the cause of alienated labor, it is rather its consequence, just as the gods are originally not the cause but the effect of man's intellectual confusion. Later, this relationship becomes reciprocal. Continuing, only at the culmination of the development of private property does its secret appear again, and namely, on the one hand, it is the product of alienated labor, and that on the other, it is the means by which alienated labor alienates itself, the realization of this alienation. I have to say here, I completely disagree. In that the concept of private property is precisely why alienated labor is what it is in capitalism. I think alienated labor exists before capitalism. But property, whether one calls it private, whether it is private property in the sense of its full meaning, of, that it is mine and I can do with it as I will and dispose of it as I will, precedes capitalism. It's not precedes this idea of alienation, or at best, one would probably say it comes about as a dual phase in which both of them are present from the get-go. That to have private property is to have alienated labor, but it is not an alienated labor in that it is a social alienated labor from me, so much as it is a self-alienation of I can get rid of this as I will. I grow corn, under no dictates of anybody else, and yet I can go to market if I have some extra and exchange that. That doesn't seem to be counting as any form of alienated labor in the sense of I'm under a master or something. That doesn't make any sense. And yet it is private property. It is alienated labor. But that labor is alienated in the object and not in itself. Alienated labor only comes about because of private property. It doesn't make sense to say the other way around is what works. And one would say, wait a minute, private property is a concept, it's a relationship. You'd have to do something. You have to do something about which was the generator of private property. And the reality is, private property is a social relationship, but it's a social relationship of recognition and will. You don't have to do anything to say something is yours. It's whatever society recognizes in it. It used to be that finders, it used to be here in the U.S. At first, it was finders keepers. If you're the first person on the land, it's yours. And all that jazz. So it just doesn't make sense. It's not first that I recognized someone else and said, he's the capitalist and I'm the worker, and then that creates private property. No, I am the worker and he's the boss because I have already recognized private property. Otherwise, why would I be working for them? Why would I accept that it is their means of production which I must use and their raw materials which I must use and which I don't get to keep? Um, Private property already seems to precede that.
Well, you could also talk to about things like the reproduction of the system and how you recognize something as private property because you're born into a system that conditions you into thinking that private property is a legitimate thing. Like it's the way that things are done. It's there's no alternative per se.
Yeah, yeah,
Little Althusserianism there.
yeah. So there, you're forced. You're necessitated to alienate your labor to work for someone else under their rules and dictates. Uh, but it's not because there was a time in which sort of a Rousseauian idea of a man one day walked up on the beach and drew a square and he says, "This is mine." It would be like saying that came about because somebody came and did a bit of work, recognized that guy, is like, "Oh, he's the master, I'm the worker, I'll do a bit of work, but he's the master, therefore, and I did the work for him, it's his object now." Um, that too doesn't work with alienated labor. His notion of alienated labor here just seems reversed, because still the social relationship precedes the activity, the social activity.
Mhm.
One can then say later, once the whole thing is set up, that they mutually constitute themselves, in which the alienation of labor just reproduces private property, and private property reproduces alienated labor, which is true. But from the beginning of the system, it cannot be the case that it begins with alienated labor as such. It begins with a notion of private property. A conception of ourselves in society and what is legitimate and what's not. Yeah. So here, ironically, I think Marx is pulling an idealist trick in which he reverses the role of what really happens. In trying to privilege a material process of labor, um, he reverses the actuality of, well, things are as they are in society. Why? Well, because we have come to accept them as they are, and we are born into a culture which constitutes our very conception of ourselves in that very way, and then we act according to it. It's too much of a denial of the so-called superstructure. Continuing, this exposition immediately sheds light on various hitherto unsolved conflicts. 1. Political economy starts from labor as the real soul of production, yet to labor it gives nothing, and to private property everything. Confronting this contradiction, Proudhon has decided in favor of labor against private property. We understand, however, that this apparent contradiction is the contradiction of estranged labor with itself, and that political economy has merely formulated the laws of estranged labor. All right. It just seems to me like an autistic reversal, really. Of once you see the whole system, they mutually constitute themselves. They reproduce each other. To make this point of, well, I think historically this is what happened. I think historically he's wrong. As well as logically. All right. Well, just to continue and make a point on that. For example, the phenomenology spirit, the famous master-slave dialectic. What happens there is two people meet who take themselves to be the only consciousness and the only absolute in the world. And they meet another one of their kind. And so when they look at each other, they say, "Hey, that's another one of me." And the other one says, "No, you're another one of me." And they vie for who is the real me, who is the real self, and who is the mere reflection or extension of repetition of myself. So they can engage in a struggle to the death and kill each other, and nobody wins. Nothing advances. Or one of them, gets beaten to a pulp and then says, "Fine, fine, I'll accept. Yeah, I'll say, Uncle, you're the real me. I'm just a relative to you." So they become the slave, and they become seen as a master. But this was not a self-estrangement of labor. This was a forced social relationship in which it wasn't, oh, I recognize him as a master. No, I was forced into a relationship in which I had to or give up my life. And it's not because I recognize him as essentially the master. It's just like, well, he beat the shit out of me. Nothing
You
I
have
can do
that
about it.
you have that repressive aspect there. Like, um,
Yeah, it's a repression. It's an active relationship, which is a social relationship, which is not one of labor, but it creates a form of labor. Now I have a slave that does all the things for me. And what's he gonna do? Nothing, because I'm just gonna beat him to death if he doesn't. So in order to stay alive, well, most people are gonna go ahead and bear with it until the day comes in which you can quietly slip a noose on the master's neck while he sleeps. So continuing. We also understand, therefore, that wages and private property are identical. Indeed, where the product is the object of labor pays for labor itself, where the wage is but a necessary consequence of labor's estrangement. Likewise, in the wage of labor, labor does not appear as an end in itself, but as a servant of the wage. We shall develop this point later, and meanwhile we'll only draw some conclusions. So this is one of those weird identity collapses that he makes. Private property and wages are identical. One can say private property and wages are obviously necessarily related, uh, in the sense of a fully systematic, generalized commodity production society in which capitals form, and the concentration of capital in the form of both goods, material wealth, as well as uh, value, uh, are centered, and therefore the rest of the people are forced into the relationship of having to work for someone else because they own nothing themselves with which they can produce. They own no means of production. They only own their labor power.
well, too, I mean, there is a difference between worker self-management versus worker ownership of the factory. Like, you could have a scenario where workers manage themselves and they decide their own wages and such, but they don't own the means of production.
Yeah. All right, continuing. An enforced increase of wages, disregarding all other difficulties, including the fact that it would only be by force, too, that such an increase, being an anomaly, could be maintained, would therefore be nothing but better payment for the slave, and would not win either for the worker or for labor their human status and dignity. Indeed, even the equality of wages, as demanded by Proudhon, only transforms the relationship of the present day worker to his labor into the relationship of all men to labor. Society would then be conceived as an abstract capitalist. Wages are a direct consequence of estranged labor, and estranged labor is the direct cause of private property. The downfall of the one must therefore involve the downfall of the other. So, here I think he's also just been, he was logically and empirically wrong, in which an increase of wages most definitely makes you more of a human being. You're not starving to death, you're not losing your life over constant stress of, can I make the bills this month? You can actually afford to go on vacations, you can afford to send your kids to college, you can afford to go to the theater and enjoy the high cultural arts. You can afford a lot of things with a higher wage, which do reflect back and give back some measure of more humanity, with which there is a very marked difference as opposed to somebody who's literally living paycheck by paycheck on bare subsistence. And the point about the abstract capitalist, he makes that point later again in the other work that we read, Private Property and Communism. So wages are a direct consequence of estranged labor. Um, all right, in a far more developed sense, yes. So far here, he doesn't quite show the necessary connection and development in which this is the case. Otherwise, I can agree with it for its limited part. Continuing, two, from the relationship of estranged labor to private property, it follows further that the emancipation of society from private property, etc., from servitude, is expressed in the political form of the emancipation of the workers. Not that their emancipation alone is at stake, but because the emancipation of the workers contains universal human emancipation, and it contains this because the whole of human servitude is involved in the relation of the worker to production, and all relations of servitude are but modifications and consequences of this relation. Um, once again, the typical reduction to economics and labor, in which Marx reduces all of society to really just being this whole play of labor and what labor does. In which I think it's just not true. I think empirically we see this as not true. We see this also as not logically true, in that it does not necessarily follow. And I think that people from the Frankfurt School actually do an immense job of showing just like how this relationship is not just all reducible to labor. There are cultural aspects which just go beyond just the simple work one does. Religious self-estrangement is not just an estrangement of economics. It's not just a relationship of production. But yeah, so here we see why he says that the emancipation of the worker from the emancipation of society from private property is the emancipation of everybody, because private property is just alienated labor. Alienated labor produces both the inhumanity of the worker as well as the inhumanity of the capitalist. And so, we get to, if we get rid of that, we get to save everybody. The root of the problem which creates it all goes away. Continuing, just as we have derived the concept of private property from the concept of estranged alienated labor by analysis. No, he hasn't. Not really. So we can develop every category of political economy with the help of these two factors, and we shall find again in each category, for example, trade, competition, capital, money, only a particular and developed expression of these first elements. But before considering this phenomenon, however, let us try to solve two other problems. One, to define the general nature of private property as it has arisen as a result of estranged labor, in its relation to truly human and social property. If we have accepted the estrangement of labor, its alienation, as a fact, and we have analyzed this fact, how, we now ask, does man come to alienate, to estrange his labor? How is this estrangement rooted in the nature of human development? We have already gone a long way to the solution of this problem by transforming the question of the origin of private property into the question of the relation of alienated labor to the course of humanity's development. For when one speaks of private property, one thinks of dealing with something external to man. When one speaks of labor, one is directly dealing with man himself. This new formulation of the question already contains its solution. Frankly, I think this is completely reversed. For when we speak of private property, one thinks of dealing with something external to man, whereas in private property, it is absolutely a social reality, the only thing which is purely existent in and through and for humanity. It's a pure product of recognition. When one speaks of labor, one is directly dealing with man himself. Whereas when one speaks of labor, one can be speaking about man alone, the wild man, the civilized man, the poor man, the cultured man, spiritual man, any kind of man. It's not something that's directly social. Labor is not necessarily a social category as such. It's something that we do, but it's not something that we necessarily will uh, do only for each other. It can be social and not social, but private property absolutely must be social and cannot be dealing with anything other than what is, human. So we're almost done with this, so I just want to finish it off. So, as to one, the general nature of private property and its relation to truly human property. Alienated labor has resolved itself for us into two components which depend on one another, or which are but different expressions of one and the same relationship. Appropriation appears as estrangement, as alienation, and alienation appears as appropriation, estrangement as truly becoming a citizen. Not quite sure what that regards. Footnote 23, this apparently refers to the conversion of individuals into members of civil society, which is considered as the sphere of property of material relations that determine all relations. In this case, Marx refers to the material relations of society based on private property and the antagonism of different classes. That is, you're not really a citizen if you don't have private property. At least if you must at least own, quote unquote, own yourself to be, a bourgeois citizen and an engager in the economy. You can't be a slave because otherwise, you're not a buyer. You're not going to be doing anything of the sort. You are a commodity yourself. Continuing, we have considered the one side alienated labor in relation to the worker himself, that is, the relation of alienated labor to itself. The product and necessary outcome of this relation, as we have seen, is the property relation of the non-worker to the worker and to labor. Private property, as the material summary expression of alienated labor, embraces both relations, the relation of the worker to work and to the product of his labor and to the non-worker, and the relation of the non-worker to the worker and to the product of his labor. Once again, by private property here, he's talking specifically about capitalist appropriated property. It both means production as well as the products of labor within a capitalist production process. But private property as such is more than just that. Like I was saying, you go out into the world. It used to be that you went out in the west of the United States, and if you got there first, it was yours. What that had to do with any production is beyond me. I don't think it really applies. Saying, hey, you can't take those are my chickens. What that has to do with alienated labor is beyond me. I don't think it applies. But continuing, having seen that in relation to the worker who appropriates nature by means of his labor, this appropriation appears as estrangement, his own spontaneous activity as activity for another, and as activity of another, vitality as a sacrifice of life, production of the object as loss of the object to an alien power, to an alien person. We shall now consider the relation of the worker to labor and to its object. To labor and its object of this person who is alien to labor and the worker. First, it has to be noted that everything which appears in the worker as an activity of alienation, of estrangement, appears in the non-worker as a state of alienation, of estrangement. Secondly, that the worker's real practical attitude in production into the product as a state of mind appears in the non-worker who confronted him as a theoretical attitude. Thirdly, the non-worker does everything against the worker which the worker does against himself, but he does not do against himself what he does against the worker. Let us look more closely at these three relations, and it breaks off here. So that final section is about the mutual dehumanization of the worker as well as the capitalist, the owner, the alien power. You know that if the worker is alienated, so, he says, first it has to be noted that everything which appears in the worker as an activity of alienation, of estrangement, appears in the non-worker as a state of alienation, of estrangement. So, in being alienated as an activity, the capitalist is alienated as just a fact, a matter of fact, or a state of alienation. Uh, the boss is alienated, even though he did nothing that was alienating to them. At least that's how I understand it. Difference between activity and just a passive state. Secondly, the worker's real practical attitude in production into the product as a state of mind appears in the non-worker as confronting him as a theoretical attitude. I guess, it's like the worker feels shitty. He's like, whoa, this really sucks. I wish I could be doing something else. And to the non-worker, the boss, he's like, seems pretty shitty, but it's not my job. That's what you get to be paid for, wage slave.
Um, hmm. Not exactly at the moment.
All right, I thought like a lot of it was good. I thought it's talking about a real thing. The stuff when he starts getting about trying to derive private property from alienated labor is just where I think he really goes awry. Also, the collapse of everything into just like it's all alienated labor. It's all because of alienated labor. I don't think so.
Well, again, that is a very reductionist point of view to hold. To say that everything just boils down to alienated labor.
Yeah, I think it misses a huge, huge chunk of the human experience as a cultural one, as one that is, you're brought up in a society and you are constituted by that society. So you have certain conceptions of yourself within it in relation to others, in relation to the world, in relation to an otherworldly world, if you have such a conception. And so all of those are different forms of alienation, which do not necessarily arise just because you get to, uh, do and create expressive works of labor. For example, artists are a lot of at least the great artists, a lot of them, have definite moments in which like they're just so alienated from themselves, and their works of art are only like these expressions of how they feel about themselves, how they see themselves.
Mm.
And they're doing exactly what Marx thinks is the solution of everything. If we could just do what we wanted, if we could just be freely creative, alienation would be over. But that's not true. There's
Well, you
always
can't.
this tension. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, you can't exactly just opt out of the society completely either. I mean, I guess there are ways to kind of maneuver the society, but even if you are all by yourself and you're all alone, I mean, you still have that conditioning that the system has placed on you. You're not, I mean, maybe it is possible to completely divorce your mind or to try to mentally transcend that stuff, but at the same time, I mean, you're still heavily weighted down by it. I mean, you could say too that most of this ideological reproduction occurs outside the workplace in the greater culture as a whole. And I mean, I know like I'm kind of, it's much this is a pretty convoluted topic, but still like um again, it's all that like these exterior factors that really don't have that much to do with the actual working environment, but which are all tied together like within this capitalist system. I'm sorry if I'm rambling and not making sense.
No, it makes sense. Definitely, it's the kind of things Marcuse talks about in the One-Dimensional Man.
Exactly.
So we can't just reduce everything to it's all about labor, and you must have conceptions which can deal with and contextualize and construct this non-alienated conception. I mean, I think it's possible. I really do. I think at least we can have a way in which we can have a society in which the culture is one in which we are at least made as aware as one could possibly ever make anything of our unity, of our essence in humanity. That doesn't, however, necessarily mean that alienation is not going to happen, that humans won't be alienated from humans. I think there's just a certain level in which that's unfortunately the case, and it becomes an even tougher case the more and more we get into modernity, and the more we have let go of the grand narratives, and the less and less we believe in the big other. Once you're left to just free float, no longer is it that you're guaranteed a wife. No, you got to go find love, and this love is not guaranteed at all. You meet someone who you think is your soulmate, and they stab your heart or whatever, or they just lose interest in you and say, sorry, we had 2 kids, we've been together for 18 years, but I just don't love you anymore. I love Chad. And they go off.
Yeah, just that one day where they just decide they hate you, and then they just cut you off from your life or their life, and they just never want to talk to you again. I mean, it hurts. It really, really hurts.
Yeah. What are we reading?
Oh,
we
we're
were
done.
reading. Yeah, we're done with
Oh.
Estranged Labor. We finished it.
Oh, okay. So what are we talking about?
We're still
Alienation.
regarding alienation. Yeah, we're
Yeah.
talking about comments on alienation.
Okay.
The major things that went on in this one was he went more onto private property, and he says that private property is alienated labor. But he makes the relation, which makes sense, by the way. It's just the way he says it, in which it's a product of alienated labor, is to me nonsense. In that the notion of private property, the concept, works without having to do any production whatsoever. You can go out and walk. It used to be that you could go out in the West, in the United States, and if you walked far enough, if nobody owned it, it was yours. Free land.
Homesteading.
Yeah, homesteading.
Sure.
And so it doesn't make sense to say that alienated labor is what produces private property. Rather, I think it's originally the opposite. It's private property that ends up producing alienated labor. And then they just reproduce each other. But even then, it's kind of it makes sense in taking his assumptions. But even then, it's the only alienated labor is the labor that you actually do. But the product itself, to call it alienated labor, is the thing I complained about in what was it? I think the last time, in which the collapse of a distinction between a process, an activity, and a thing. In this sense, doesn't work.
You think it's just an overreaction?
Obviously, I think it's obviously like he was overreacting. He had his disillusion with Hegel, which in case people don't know, I don't have the book on hand right now. I don't remember what the title was, but I'll mention it in the description. Marx was like pretty much a liberal Hegelian before this, or at least he considered himself such, uh, because he didn't really understand Hegel. He just liked his ideas. And so all of this is a huge counter reaction. He reads Feuerbach and he says, "Fuck," Feuerbach has destroyed him. And he says he also has criticisms of Feuerbach already, and he just says here he's critiquing both Feuerbach, he's critiquing Hegel, and he's trying to mix Feuerbach and Hegel as well as a critique of Hegel. So he wants to use Hegelianism against itself to go beyond itself, which is a fine thing to do. If you're gonna do it, that's the way to do it. The thing is, he clearly doesn't have a mastery of what dialectics, what Hegel's method really is, and so the identifications in the movements which he makes don't really follow. Yeah, they make sense, but when he's trying to make these necessary connections, it doesn't really work. But yeah, we'll cut the recording off here. Whoever listens to this, hope you liked it, hope you learned something. See you next time.